Welcome to the Style Blues Podcast. This is where we talk about sewing a beautiful wardrobe and creating a beautiful home. If you have style blues, we can fix it. Your host is Jessica Cramer, apparel designer and blogger at chambrayblues.com. Listen in and let your blues disappear.
Welcome to the Style Blues Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Cramer. I'm glad you're here today. We're going to talk about some interesting things. We're going to learn a little bit about the history of sewing so we can kind of move forward and learn some of the basic lingo and things that are used in the sewing industry. However, I think that it's important to kind of know where all those things come from. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of how it all kind of came about. During the Industrial Revolution, and the production of textiles moved from being produced in the home where people, grew their own cotton and other fibers and made their own cloth to being mass manufactured or manufactured on a larger scale in a textile mill. And it wasn't until about 1800 that sewing machines actually came around, and by about 1840 they became fairly popular. Even the first Singer sewing machine didn't come out until around 1850. And for that period of time, most clothing was still produced at home by women who sewed and made clothes for themselves and their families. There were, however, sweatshops full of people, women, of course, who were paid very little money to sew garments. And the term sweatshop comes from way back during that period of time. Interestingly enough, we still use the term sweatshops to describe a sewing factory today. A lot of them are still full of women who sew to feed their families. In foreign countries, sometimes they have children, underage children who sew, which is really illegal. But at times it has been discovered that companies get away with using kids to manufacture their clothing at times. So the way that things were sewn at the time was by piecework. What that means is that you get paid per piece for how many bodices you can sew during a day or during a certain amount of time. And that process is still being used today in the garment factories. Workers are still paid on piecework. And when you see videos of them sitting at the machines, it's just astounding how fast they can sew a garment, because time is money, and the faster they produce, the more money they can make. Even though most of the time it's very little money that they get, pennies per piece. And even was back in the early days, women work, 12, 14-hour days to support their families, and a lot of times even rented sewing machines because they couldn't afford to buy one, which left them practically nothing to live on. So during the time, high-end tailors became more popular. That was around the early 19th century. In London, some of the first tailors were established around Savile Row in London. And as time went on, sewing machines became more affordable. Working class people could afford them. The demand for sewing patterns grew. So women had been accustomed to seeing the latest fashions and clothes and magazines during the 18th and 19th centuries. And that increased the demand for sewing patterns even more. American tailor manufacturer Ebenezer Butterick was one of the first companies to make paper patterns that could be traced and used by home sewers. And the patterns were incredibly popular. As you know, Butterick is still in business today. And several other pattern companies came into being. McCall's, Vogue, Simplicity, Berta was a later addition, but all of those were incredibly popular all throughout the 20th century. So I had a friend who is a little bit older than I am, and she was telling me how when she was in high school, absolutely everybody sewed. Like, that's just what you did. Everybody sewed their own clothes. And when I was in high school, I was the only one who sewed her own clothes. In fact, kids used to make fun of me because I sewed my own clothes. And it's just an interesting how when women started going off to work, the trend for sewing just took a nosedive. There were so many women who went into work, didn't have time to sew, or no longer had interest, wanted to do things differently than their parents, than their mothers did before them. And they just kind of dropped sewing as something they wanted to do. And a lot of us kids never learned much sewing from our parents. I didn't learn to sew really from my mother. She could sew very basic things. She could hem a curtain or, sew on buttons, but very basic kinds of things. She wasn't really interested in sewing much clothing, and she didn't really pass any of that knowledge on to me. Unfortunately, I suppose I could have asked her. I could have pressed her for information, but it didn't occur to me at the time. So I learned from a friend of mine who was interested in sewing. And after that, I was pretty much self-taught until I went to college. So today, of course, clothing is mass-produced and is all based on, clothes are based on standard body measurements that are supposed to fit the greatest proportion of the population. Well, you and I know that going shopping can be a really frustrating thing because certain brands run differently than others. The fit is inconsistent at times. It can be completely different from one brand to the next. In women's apparel, menswear is a little different story because menswear, they use measurements for standard sizing, whereas in women's, we don't. We don't like having our actual measurements known to anyone. And it's just really irritating. What makes things worse is today, with the onset of mass manufacturing and budget garments, they take shortcuts in the way that things are sewn, and they can be very inconsistent, as well as fabrics can be very cheap. You wash them, they shrink, they're transparent, they don't last, the elasticity wears out, the spandex gives out. You know how that goes. You buy a garment, you wear it for a while, and then it's no longer wearable for whatever reason, one reason or another. Even companies that have had really good quality in the past, I've noticed, I usually buy from just a handful of ready-to-wear companies because I know that they're good quality. But lately, I've just been really dissatisfied with those too. They're just not making things the way that they used to. That's just a sign of the times. So I think that there's a huge resurgence in people who want to learn to sew. I have been teaching learn to sew classes for several months now and kind of gotten to know some of these people, what they're looking for. These young people who really want to learn to sew but have no idea where to start. So that's why I'm here. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to learn all kinds of things about sewing. It's not rocket science, and you can do it. So just a few words about some ins and outs of garment construction, and then we're going to move on to more specific things in the next episode. But just a few general guidelines. When you're in the fabric store, you're picking out a pattern, you need to go in there with your body measurements. It is so much easier if you know what size pattern to look for. Now, do not mistake your body measurements for being the same as a ready-to-wear size. For example, if you wear a size 6 in a Land's End, it is not the same as a size 6 Butterick pattern. They are very different. So you need to look at the back of the pattern envelope. Usually it's on the flap. It will have basic measurements, body measurements for each size. So it usually has bust, waist, and hip measurements. Sometimes it will include a measurement from center back neck to waist, or center back neck to down the arm to the wrist. Sleeve length. Basically, it's a sleeve length measurement, but it's measured from the center back neck down the arm. So before you go into a fabric store, before you even begin to think about picking out a pattern, take your measurements at home. I'm going to do a Facebook Live video on this, so if you need to know exactly where to measure, I can show you that on Facebook Live. It should be on the Chambray Blues Facebook page. And Once you have that information, then you're ready to go to the store and pick out a pattern. I've also done a video on how to use a pattern book. They have a certain type of structure, and it's easy if you know how it works. However, if you've never done it before, it's a little bit different than other types of catalogs. So there's that video on my Facebook page too. So if you can pick out a pattern that you want to learn to sew, great. I have put together a list of 12 commercial patterns that are going to be in my Sew Along Masterclass beginning the first part of January 2018. And these patterns are commercially produced. There's a McCall's, there's a Vogue. I'm using a kind of a sampling of different patterns so you can get a feel for things. You can take your measurements, find a pattern in your size, and then request to join the group. I'm going to leave the group open for a time until I have probably about 100 people. I think I'll probably have to close it around 100 people so that I can really help those people be successful. We are going to do one project per month for each month of the year of 2018. And we'll just kind of see how it goes. Some of the projects might be a little simpler. If we can get most of us through them, we may be able to do 2 projects in a particular month, but it just sort of depends on how much help people need and how much time they need to complete things. So in the masterclass, you're going to learn how to alter your pattern, how to properly lay it out and cut it, how to sew it, how to fit it, how to pick out fabric, trims, notions, all those kinds of things. We're going to go over them step by step. It's intended for people who have never sewn before. These are going to be easy patterns. We're going to work with a variety of fabrics, everything from fleece to knits, some cotton wovens. We'll maybe even get into using a bit of wool or specialty fabric like velvet or satin towards the end of the year after you've had time to build up some skill in those areas. And that's the plan. So you can find out more about the masterclass. I'll leave the link in the show notes with very specific photos of what the styles are going to be, what the patterns are, and how to join. So I hope that you will consider that. And we are going to talk more about specific sewing notions and things, basic supplies that you will want to have on hand to work with during the masterclass and just for sewing in general in our next episode. So if you would make sure and be back for that, that'd be great. Also, if you need to get in touch with me, if you have any questions about the masterclass or about the episodes coming up, you can reach me at info@designerssweetspot.com. That's info@designerssweetspot.com. I always look through my emails. I will answer your email and get back to your questions. Also, you can find me, of course, on social media. My lifestyle blog is designerssweetspot.com, where I share creative ways to have a beautiful home and sew a beautiful wardrobe, along with DIY and crafts. And also on my Chambray Blues shop page, chambrayblues.com is the shop where I sell the patterns that I design. And the Chambray Blues Patterns and Tutorials page on Facebook is where we will be sharing a lot of the masterclass techniques and so forth. So make sure and like that as well. All right, so that's all I have for today. Kind of a short episode, but there's going to be a lot more to come, and I have some guests that we're going to be talking with too, which will be a lot of fun. So we will talk to you next time. Thanks.
You are listening to the Style Blues Podcast. If you have questions about this episode, you can contact us by email, info@chambrayblues.com, or visit our Chambray Blues Sewing Patterns and Tutorials Facebook page and group. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. Until next time, style those blues.